The woman on the floor of the debtors' ward had not spoken in 6 days. Her name was Eleanor Whitby. She was 31 years old, and the last person who had called her by that name was the magistrate who signed the order to lock her away. That was 3 months ago. Now she sat with her back pressed against cold stone, her knees drawn up beneath a dress that had once been the color of winter cream. It was gray now, stained at the hem, torn along the left sleeve where another woman had grabbed it during a fight over bread. Eleanor did not fight back that day. She simply let go of the bread and walked to her corner. The ward smelled of damp wool and something worse beneath it. Old sweat, old wood, the kind of smell that crawls into your skin and stays. 32 women lived in this single room. Some had been here weeks. Some had been here years. A few no longer remembered why. Eleanor remembered everything. She remembered the house on Cheltenham Row, the ivy along the front wall, the way her mother used to arrange fresh lavender on the dining table every Sunday morning. She remembered the day her father collapsed at his desk, the sound his body made against the oak floor, the way the ink pot rolled off the edge and shattered, black ink spreading across white tile like something alive. And she remembered the debts. Her father, Edward Whitby, had been a merchant of moderate success and enormous pride. He dressed well. He spoke well. He gave the appearance of a man who had never missed a payment in his life. But behind the doors of the Cheltenham house, the truth was something else entirely. Creditors had been circling for years, quiet letters at first, then louder ones, then men at the door with their hats removed and their voices low, asking to speak with Mr. Whitby directly. Edward handled them all, smiled, promised, borrowed from one to repay another. And then he died. He died on a Tuesday in November, and by Friday, the letters were addressed to his widow. Eleanor's mother, Catherine, was not a woman built for war. She was soft-spoken and careful. She believed the best of everyone, including her husband. When the true size of the debt was revealed, Catherine's hands would not stop shaking for 3 days. £460. In that era, for a family with no income and no title, it may as well have been the moon. If this story is pulling you in, stay close. It only gets harder from here. Catherine turned to her eldest son, Richard. He was 28, married, living on the other side of Bristol with a wife who came from money and opinions. Richard came to the house once, just once. He looked at the papers, he looked at his mother, and then he said 5 words that would carve themselves into Eleanor's chest for the rest of her life. "This is not my burden." He left before supper. Catherine wrote to her younger son, James, who had taken a naval appointment and was stationed near Plymouth. His reply arrived 11 days later. It was 4 lines. He expressed sorrow for his father. He wished his mother well. He made no mention of the debt. And he did not mention Eleanor at all. So it was Eleanor who sat beside her mother each night, sorting through papers she barely understood. It was Eleanor who sold the silver, the chairs, the painting above the fireplace that her grandmother had brought from Exeter. It was not enough. The creditors did not care about grief. They cared about coin. When the final demand arrived, it carried a warning: pay within 30 days, or face the court. Catherine stopped eating. Her skin turned the color of candle wax. She sat in the empty parlor and stared at a wall where a painting used to hang. Eleanor did the only thing she could think of. She went to the creditor's office herself. She asked for more time. She begged. The man behind the desk was not cruel, but he was not kind either. He told her the law did not bend. Not for women, not for tears. The court date came on a cold morning in January. Eleanor wore her best dress, the cream one. She pinned her hair and stood straight. The magistrate read the figures aloud. He asked if there was anyone present to speak on behalf of the Whitby family. No one stood. Not Richard, not James, not a single cousin, uncle, or friend of her father. Catherine was too ill to attend. She had been carried to bed the night before and had not risen since. Eleanor stood alone. The ruling was simple. The debt would be held against the surviving members of the household, and since Eleanor was the only one present and the only one residing at the Cheltenham address, the obligation fell to her. She was taken to the debtors' ward at Marshalsea that same afternoon. They let her keep her dress. They let her keep a small comb and a handkerchief embroidered with her initials. Everything else was taken. The door closed behind her, and the sound it made was not loud. It was soft, a click, almost polite. That was the worst part. Now, 3 months later, Eleanor sat in her corner and watched the light move across the floor. It came through a narrow window set high in the wall. Each morning, it entered as a thin gold line. By afternoon, it had crawled halfway across the room. By evening, it was gone. She had begun measuring her days by that light. She did not know that across the city, in a house on Grosvenor Square, a man had just read her name for the first time. Lord Ashford, the Duke of Dorset, was not the sort of man who read court circulars for entertainment, but his solicitor, a careful man named Pemberton, had placed a document on his desk that morning, alongside a note. "Your Grace, you may wish to see this. The Whitby matter. It concerns the daughter." Ashford set down his tea and picked up the page. He read it once, then again. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the window. Rain moved down the glass in uneven lines. "How old is she?" he asked. 31, Your Grace." "And the family?" Pemberton folded his hands. "The mother is bedridden. The eldest son has refused involvement. The younger son has not responded to any correspondence." Ashford said nothing for a long time. Then he stood. "Prepare the full account. Every creditor. Every figure." Pemberton blinked. "Your Grace, the total is considerable. I did not ask for the total. I asked you to prepare it." That evening, Ashford sat alone in his study. The fire had burned low. A single candle flickered on the edge of his desk. He opened the Whitby file and read every page. He had never met Eleanor Whitby. He had never spoken to her father. He had no connection to the family, no shared circle, no common acquaintance. But he knew the ward she was in. He had visited Marshalsea once, years ago, on a matter involving a former tenant. He remembered the smell, the walls, the women who sat in rows, staring at nothing. His jaw tightened. He picked up his pen, dipped it in ink, and he began to write a letter that no one would ever see. Not Eleanor, not Pemberton, not the court. A letter to himself. The candle burned down to a stub. The fire turned to ash. And still, his pen moved. The next morning, Lord Ashford was dressed before dawn. His valet, a man named Graves, who had served the household for 19 years, noticed the change immediately. Ashford was not a man who rushed. He moved through mornings, the way rivers moved through valleys. Steady, unhurried. But today, his coat was buttoned before the clock struck 6. His boots were on before the tea was poured. "Will you be needing the carriage, Your Grace?" "No." Ashford walked. He walked through the gray streets of Mayfair, past the iron gates of Berkeley Square, through the narrowing lanes that led toward the river. The air changed as he moved south. It grew heavier, wetter. The smell of coal gave way to the smell of the Thames, thick and brown and ancient. He stopped outside a narrow building on Borough High Street. The sign above the door read, "Hartwell and Sons, Solicitors at Law." This was not Pemberton's office. This was someone else entirely. Ashford had chosen this firm for one reason. They had no connection to his household, his name, or his circle. Anything done through Hartwell would remain invisible. He stepped inside. The clerk at the front desk was a young man with ink-stained fingers and a collar that had been washed too many times. He looked up and immediately straightened. "I need to speak with Mr. Hartwell," Ashford said. "The elder." "Do you have an appointment, sir?" "No." "May I ask your name?" "You may not." The clerk swallowed. He disappeared behind a door. 40 seconds later, he returned with an older man whose spectacles sat crookedly on his nose. Thomas Hartwell was 63. He had spent 40 years untangling debts, disputes, and the quiet disasters of ordinary families. He had seen enough of the world to recognize a man who did not want to be recognized. He led Ashford to a back room, closed the door, sat down. "I will not give you my name," Ashford began, "and I will not explain my reasons. I need you to settle a debt on behalf of a woman currently held in the Marshalsea. Her name is Eleanor Whitby." Hartwell removed his spectacles and cleaned them with his thumb. "The full debt. Every coin. That is unusual, sir." "I am aware." Hartwell put his spectacles back on. "And the terms?" "There are no terms. The payment will be made in full. Miss Whitby will be released, and she will never know where the money came from." Hartwell studied the man across from him. He had sat across from hundreds of clients, men who paid debts for mistresses, men who paid debts for illegitimate children, men who paid debts to silence scandal. This man did not fit any of those shapes. "May I ask, sir, what your connection is to the Whitby family?" Ashford looked at him directly. "None." Hartwell held the gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "I will need the full creditor list." Ashford reached into his coat and placed a folded document on the desk. Every name, every figure, every date. Pemberton had prepared it the night before, and Ashford had copied it by hand onto unmarked paper. Hartwell unfolded it and read. His eyebrows lifted. £460. Interest accrued. Court fees, ward fees, transport fees. The total had grown to £512. "This will take several days to process," Hartwell said. "Each creditor must be contacted individually. Receipts must be obtained. Then begin today." Ashford placed a leather pouch on the desk. Inside were banknotes and coin, more than enough to cover the full amount with surplus for Hartwell's fees. He stood, adjusted his coat, walked to the door. "Sir," Hartwell said quietly. Ashford paused but did not turn. "She will ask. They always ask. What shall I tell her?" "Tell her the debt has been resolved. Nothing more." The door clicked shut behind him. Back at Marshalsea, Eleanor did not know that a clock had begun ticking in her favor. She knew only the rhythm of the ward. The bell at 6, the bread at 7, the slow shuffle of women moving through the same stone room, like fish circling a pond that had no outlet. She had made one friend, if friendship was even the right word. Agnes Barrow was 54. She had been in the ward for 2 years. Her husband had abandoned her with a shop full of unpaid invoices and a son who had sailed for the colonies without leaving a forwarding address. Agnes did not complain. She did not weep. She sat beside Eleanor each morning and spoke in a low, steady voice about whatever crossed her mind. The weather outside, which she guessed by the color of the light, the sound of the birds, the particular way the bread tasted on Thursdays, which was slightly better than the other days, though no one could explain why. "You have not eaten again," Agnes said one morning. Eleanor looked down at the bread in her hand. She had been holding it for 20 minutes without taking a bite. "I forget." "You do not forget. You choose not to." Eleanor said nothing. Agnes reached over and broke the bread in half. She placed one piece in Eleanor's lap and kept the other. "Eat with me. It is easier when you are not doing it alone." Eleanor looked at the older woman. Agnes had deep lines around her mouth and eyes that had lost their brightness years ago. But her hands were steady. Her voice was calm. She was the most anchored person Eleanor had ever met, in a place designed to make you drift. Eleanor took a small bite. Agnes nodded once and looked away, as if the moment required no further acknowledgement. That afternoon, A guard appeared at the ward door. He was a broad man with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the walls. "Whitby," he said. Eleanor's stomach dropped. She stood slowly. 31 other women watched her walk across the room. The guard led her down a corridor she had not seen before. The air was different here, cooler. The walls were whitewashed instead of bare stone. There was a door at the end with a brass handle. He opened it. Inside was a small room with a table, 2 chairs, and a window that actually had glass. A man sat at the table, older, spectacles, ink-stained fingers. Thomas Hartwell stood when she entered. "Miss Whitby, please sit." Eleanor sat. Her hands were in her lap, her fingers pressed hard against each other. "Who are you?" "My name is Thomas Hartwell. I am a solicitor." "I have no money for a solicitor. I am not here to collect. I am here to inform you that the debt held against your name has been settled." Eleanor did not move. She did not blink. Hartwell continued. "The full amount, including all accrued interest and associated fees, has been paid to every creditor listed in the original court order. I have receipts for each transaction. The court has been notified. Your release has been authorized." The room was completely still. Eleanor's lips parted, then closed. "I do not understand," she whispered. "The debt is resolved, Miss Whitby. You are free to leave." "Who paid it?" Hartwell folded his hands on the table. "I am not at liberty to disclose that information. Someone paid £500 for a woman they do not know." "The debt has been resolved," Hartwell repeated gently. "That is all I am authorized to say." Eleanor's hands began to tremble. She pressed them harder together, but it did not help. Her jaw tightened. Her breath came short and shallow. She looked at the window, at the glass, at the way the light came through it, clean and unbroken, not cut into slices by iron bars. "When?" she asked. "You may leave today, within the hour, if you wish." Eleanor stood, then sat down again, then stood once more. She looked at Hartwell with eyes that were too bright. "My mother, is she alive?" Hartwell hesitated. "I do not have information regarding your family, Miss Whitby, but I have arranged transport to return you to your home address in Cheltenham." Eleanor pressed her hand flat against the table. The wood was smooth, polished. Nothing in the ward was smooth or polished. She walked back to collect her things. The comb, the handkerchief. She had nothing else. Agnes was waiting by the corner. Eleanor knelt beside her. "They are letting me go." Agnes looked at her. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not envy. Something quieter. Something older. "Then go," Agnes said softly. Eleanor reached for her hand. Agnes let her take it. "I will come back for you." Agnes smiled. It was the first time Eleanor had seen her smile. It changed her entire face. For one brief second, she looked like someone who had once been young. "Do not make promises in this place," Agnes said. "Just walk through the door." Eleanor squeezed her hand. Then she rose and turned away. She walked down the corridor, past the guard, past the clerk who signed the release paper, past the heavy wooden door that separated the ward from the street. She stepped outside. The air hit her like a wall of cold water. She gasped. Her chest expanded. Her lungs filled with something that was not stone dust, or damp wool, or the breath of 32 women, pressed together in a room built for 10. It was wind. Actual wind. Carrying the smell of rain and horse dung and bread baking somewhere down the lane. She stood on the pavement and did not move. People passed her. A woman with a basket, a boy pulling a cart, an old man with a cane who glanced at her and looked away. None of them knew where she had just been. None of them knew what had just happened inside those walls. Eleanor looked up. The sky was white-gray, heavy with clouds. Somewhere far above, a bird circled once, then disappeared behind a rooftop. She took one step forward, then another. A carriage was waiting at the end of the street, just as Hartwell had promised. The driver tipped his hat, but did not speak. She climbed in, sat down. The seat was padded. The window had a curtain. The carriage began to move. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the glass and watched London pass. The river, the bridges, the spires of churches she had once known by name, but had forgotten. She did not cry, but her hands would not stop shaking. And across the city, in a study on Grosvenor Square, Lord Ashford sat in silence. A fire burned low. A glass of port sat untouched on his desk. Pemberton entered quietly. "It is done, Your Grace. Hartwell has confirmed the release." Ashford nodded. He did not look up. "And she was told nothing?" "Nothing, Your Grace." Ashford picked up his glass, turned it slowly in his hand, set it down again without drinking. "Good," he said. But the word did not carry the weight of satisfaction. It carried something else, something he could not name. He looked at the fire. The embers pulsed like a slow heartbeat. Then he opened a drawer and placed the letter he had written to himself inside. He closed the drawer, locked it, put the key in his waistcoat pocket. He sat there for a long time. Outside, rain began to fall. The carriage reached Cheltenham Row, just as the last light drained from the sky. Eleanor stepped down onto the street and stood before the house she had grown up in. The ivy was still there, though it had thickened and grown wild, creeping over the edges of the front windows, like fingers trying to hold the walls together. The front gate hung crooked on its hinge. The path was covered in wet leaves no one had swept. She walked to the door and placed her hand flat against it. The wood was cold, swollen from rain. She pushed it open. The hallway was dark. The air inside was stale and sweet, in a way that made her chest tight. No lavender on the dining table, no candles lit, no sound at all except the faint creak of floorboards beneath her feet. "Mother?" Her voice sounded wrong in the emptiness. Too loud, too alive. She climbed the stairs. Each step groaned under her weight, as if the house itself had grown tired of standing. The bedroom door at the end of the hall was slightly open. A thin line of candlelight spilled across the floor. Eleanor pushed it wide. Catherine Whitby lay in the bed, beneath a quilt that had been washed so many times its pattern had nearly disappeared. Her hair, once dark and carefully pinned, spread across the pillow in thin silver strands. Her skin was the color of old paper. A woman sat in a chair beside the bed. She was not family. She was Mrs. Hollis, the neighbor from 2 doors down. A plain woman, with large hands, and a face that rarely showed surprise. But when she saw Eleanor standing in the doorway, her mouth fell open. Lord above! Eleanor crossed the room and knelt beside the bed. Catherine's eyes were closed. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale a thin whistle that seemed to cost her something. Eleanor took her mother's hand. The bones were sharp beneath the skin, the fingers cold. "I am here," she said quietly. Catherine's eyelids fluttered. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Mrs. Hollis stood and moved to the doorway, giving them the room. She paused and looked back at Eleanor with an expression that held a question she would never ask out loud. Eleanor did not notice. She was watching her mother's face, searching for something she could recognize. Catherine's eyes opened. They were clouded, unfocused, but after a long moment, they found Eleanor's face and stayed there. Her cracked lips moved again. This time, a sound came through, thin as thread. "You came home." Eleanor pressed her mother's hand against her own cheek. "I came home." Catherine's fingers twitched, the smallest movement, an attempt to hold on. Then her eyes drifted closed again, and her breathing steadied into the slow rhythm of someone who had been given just enough to let go of the fight. Eleanor stayed on the floor beside the bed all night. She did not sleep. She listened to each breath as if counting them, afraid that if she stopped listening, they would stop too. By morning, Catherine's breathing had grown quieter. Mrs. Hollis returned with broth and a blanket for Eleanor, who had not moved from the floor. "Has she eaten anything?" Eleanor asked. "Very little these past weeks. She asks for water sometimes. Mostly she just sleeps." Eleanor looked at the broth, then at her mother. She dipped a cloth into the warm liquid and touched it gently to Catherine's lips. A small amount seeped through. Catherine swallowed once, then turned her head away. That was enough for now. Over the next 3 days, Eleanor cleaned the house. She opened windows. She swept floors. She scrubbed the kitchen table until the wood turned pale again. She found a bundle of dried lavender in the back of a cupboard and placed it on the dining table in a cracked cup. It was not the same, but it was something. She also found the stack of letters in her father's study. Dozens of them, sealed, unsent. Well, some addressed to creditors. Some addressed to Richard. Some addressed to no one at all. Just pages of numbers and calculations that led nowhere. Her father had known. He had known for years that the walls were closing in, and he had written letter after letter, trying to find a door that did not exist. Eleanor placed the letters back in the drawer and closed it. She did not open it again. On the 4th morning, a knock came at the front door. Eleanor opened it to find a boy no older than 12, holding a small brown parcel. He wore a cap too big for his head and boots with no laces. "Delivery for Miss Whitby," he said. "From whom?" The boy shrugged. "Was told to bring it. That is all I know." He handed her the parcel and disappeared down the lane before she could ask anything else. Eleanor brought it inside. She set it on the kitchen table and unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a small wooden box. Inside the box was a folded piece of paper and a leather purse. The purse was heavy. She opened the paper first. The handwriting was careful and even. No signature, no seal, no name. It read simply, "For the house, for your mother, for whatever comes next." Eleanor opened the purse. Inside were banknotes. She counted them twice. 100 pounds. She sat down. The chair creaked beneath her. She placed both hands flat on the table and stared at the money. Someone had paid her debt. Someone had sent her home. And now someone had given her enough to survive for a year, maybe more if she was careful. And she had no idea who. She thought of the solicitor, Hartwell, the way he had folded his hands, the way he had said, "I am not at liberty to disclose." She thought of Richard, but Richard would not have spent a penny, let alone 500. She thought of James, but James had not even written her name. She thought of her father's friends, his business associates, the men who had dined at their table and laughed at his jokes, and then vanished the moment the laughter stopped. None of them would do this. So who? The question sat in her chest, like a stone she could not swallow and could not spit out. If you have stayed with this story until now, what comes next is the part that matters most. Across the city, Lord Ashford received a short letter from Hartwell, confirming that the final parcel had been delivered. He read it at his desk, folded it once, and placed it in the locked drawer alongside the letter he had written to himself that first night. Pemberton entered the study carrying a tray of correspondence. "Your Grace, a letter has arrived from the Countess of Lennox regarding the autumn ball." Ashford waved it aside. "And Mr. Hartwell wishes to know if you require any further action regarding the Whitby matter." "No. Shall I close the file?" Ashford looked at the drawer, then at the window. Rain again. London could not stop weeping that year. "Close it," he said. Pemberton nodded and turned to leave. "Pemberton." "Your Grace? If anyone inquires about the payment, from any quarter, the answer is that an anonymous benefactor settled the account through Hartwell's office. Nothing more." "Understood, Your Grace." Pemberton left. The door closed softly behind him. Ashford sat alone. He picked up his pen, set it down, picked it up again. He was not a man who struggled with decisions. He had managed estates, settled disputes between tenants, negotiated with Parliament, and once talked a highway robber out of his pistol, using nothing but patience and a steady voice. But this matter was different. He did not know Eleanor Whitby. He had never seen her face. He had no reason to intervene, except the one reason he could not explain to anyone, including himself. He had read the court circular, and something inside him had shifted. Not broken, not cracked, shifted. Like a door that had always been closed, had moved half an inch, and through that gap came a draft he could not ignore. He had done what he could. He had done it quietly, and now it was finished. He told himself this 3 times. It did not feel finished. Back in Cheltenham, Eleanor placed the banknotes back in the purse, and the purse back in the box. She put the box on the top shelf of the kitchen cupboard, behind a row of empty jars. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the hall, at the stairs, at the thin strip of light that fell through the front window and landed on the floor like a golden thread. She had been given something extraordinary. A second chance she had not asked for, delivered by a hand she could not see. She climbed the stairs. She sat beside her mother. She took Catherine's hand again and held it. Catherine's breathing was slow but steady. A pulse moved faintly beneath the thin skin of her wrist. Eleanor leaned forward and whispered near her ear, "Someone saved us. I do not know who, but we are not alone." Catherine's fingers curled, just barely, a grip so faint it could have been imagined. But Eleanor felt it. She sat back in the chair. She looked at the window. Outside, a blackbird landed on the sill, turned its head once toward the glass, then flew away into the gray morning. Eleanor watched it go. Then she turned back to her mother and waited. Somewhere in London, a drawer was locked. Somewhere in Cheltenham, a cup of dried lavender sat on a dining table in a house that had nearly been forgotten. And somewhere between the two, a debt had been paid that had nothing to do with money.